I am delighted to be with you this morning. This is my second trip to the Frey Institute. I'm a repeat offender, but the fact that the congressman would invite me back just shows the level of risk he is willing to incur. I'm sure you know, but on the chance you don't, Frey was a terrific member of Congress, part of a group of Republican members that include my colleague at Brookings, Bill Frenzel, Barbara Conable, who went on to be head of the World Bank, and others who legislated and operated in a way, and Lou may not be comfortable with this, that you wouldn't recognize today in the Congress or within the Republican Party, and that's a subject we're going to return to. It's a thrill for me to arrive in Orlando virtually hours after Herman Cain won the straw poll here. I mean, God, what could be more American than a pizza guy who's also a conservative radio talk host? I mean, what more? What more does one need? But Florida has a special place in my heart, personally, because I moved to Florida from the Midwest when I was 12 and grew up in West Palm Beach, and then went to Gainesville for my undergraduate degree. You guys weren't here then, so I had no choice, right? Went on to the University of Michigan after that, but it still leads me to recall the infamous days of November 2000, Florida. You don't remember, you're too young, but you've read about the extraordinary experience of that, in effect, dead heat election, which took us weeks and weeks to resolve. Sort of my favorite part of it is that Al Gore lost because of a Democratic county election official, Teresa O'Neill, I think her name was, who designed on her own something called a butterfly ballot, in which it was almost impossible to link up the candidates with the box to check. All we know is that we were certain to cause problems because of a movement that apparently had been developing in the country without anyone noticing it manifested itself in Broward County, Florida, during this election, and it was called the Jews for Pat Buchanan. Now, I don't know how many of you can understand that and appreciate that, but write that down and Google it. Listen, I flew down from Washington, D.C. last night. The IMF is holding its meeting. There is a lot of tension in the air. They face, and we face globally, a European financial crisis with the ongoing drama of the Greek government simply being unable to manage its debt, leading to the possibility of an unstructured default, followed by a run on the banks, followed by a freeze of liquidity in the financial system, followed by another dip into recession. It's pretty scary. The Europeans face a structural problem. They formed a monetary union whereby they have a euro, a common currency, and a central bank, but they never formed a robust economic union so that the power over taxes and spending remains with the individual country governments. Yet the umbrella of the monetary union creates, at least early on, a sort of confidence in investors in buying paper, thinking the richest nations would always bail out the poorest ones if they got into trouble. That mismatch, that structural mismatch, is causing extraordinary problems now, and it's fascinating to see since the U.S. was out ahead of the initial subprime mortgage crisis and was blamed for much of the difficulty around the globe. Now it's Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner who's telling the Europeans what to do based on our experience. I mention it in part to emphasize the global dimensions of the problems we are dealing with, but also as a predicate to an argument I'm going to make here about the mismatch in our own government between the kinds of political parties that we have developed and the set of national political institutions that were framed 230 some years ago, a separation of powers system, checks and balances, bicameral legislature, and one chamber of that legislature, never passing a motion to recommit, therefore allowing a majority to cut off debate and vote. Without that, it means talk can go on incessantly. They passed a Rule 22 that allowed for voting cloture, but it meant a supermajority, once used infrequently over issues of high drama and passion like civil rights. It has now morphed into an automatic threshold of 60 required to get anything done, and the empowering of individual senators to basically frustrate the staffing of an administration and a judicial branch. It's a sorry state, but the structural mismatch is something I want to leave imprinted on your minds here, and have you think about it and think with me of how we operate in this environment. These are genuinely serious times, and what I want to do in the time I have with you is focus less on aspects of campaigning and more on the broader political forces, the political dysfunctions that are obvious, the stakes that we face as individuals, as a country, as part of a larger global community. These are bad times. After the global financial crisis and Great Recession, we have not sort of rebounded dramatically. Some economic historians told us this would happen. When you have a financial crisis, bubble-induced, in this case housing, mortgages, it tends to take many years to recover. It's painful, but it's been especially painful in the U.S. We get a little burst of growth and then it falls back. Our unemployment hit a peak roughly mid-2009. Then some of the responses with stimulus pegged in, but it sort of stalled around 9%, and that's where we are now. That's a very high level of unemployment. There's high unemployment, underemployment as well. A bleak outlook for new job seekers. Sorry to mention that to you at this moment. Increasing poverty. Millions more over the last couple of years have been added to the ranks of the uninsureds, those with no health insurance, whatever. We have millions as well with mortgages that are underwater, facing foreclosure. A whole set of questions emerge. there is the immediate economic crisis, but it's raising a whole host of larger questions. Wither the American dream. America is based on the whole notion of the possibility of social mobility. I was a beneficiary of that. Neither of my parents went to college. My mother stopped schooling after 8th grade. Yet all of my siblings went to college, and most who on to graduate school, and opportunities were abounded. There have been some big changes in the structure of the economy and of the global economy that raise serious questions and demand some actions to put us in a position to create the kind of jobs that can provide the kind of life for oneself and one's children and grandchildren. The question that arises is American democracy up to the challenge? Does the 2012 election, the focus of this conference, offer hope of resolving differences, of seriously grappling with the existential challenges that we face? Americans, especially American politicians, are very cocky about asserting American exceptionalism. You know, we are the epitome of the advanced industrial democracy. We have a unbroken constitutional history stretching longer than any other country. Some even argue it was all divinely inspired. In any case, we are the city on the hill. We are the ones who've had the largest economy, the sort of biggest national security apparatus. We have been the leader of the world for a good long time. But underneath all of that bravado and self-congratulations is a reality that, hey, we're not doing so hot. Our educational system ranks behind 16 or 18 or 20 other countries. We spend twice as much for health care, and we get much less than any other country. We have the most non-comprehensive health care coverage, and while we excel at the peaks of medical technology and creativity, the benefits of those great achievements are realized by relatively few of our citizens. But perhaps most discouragingly, for a country that prides itself on its special form of democracy, is the extent to which we see clear signs of a dysfunctional politics. I could place its roots back in the 60s and trace the evolution for you, but we don't have time for that. Let's just start in late 2008. George Bush was president. Series of events rattled the financial markets, the collapse of Lehman Brothers being an important part of it. There was a sense of the possibility of an utter collapse of the entire financial system, pushing us into something comparable to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And I kid you not, that was serious business. Well, the good news is our then President George Bush and his Treasury Secretary Paulson and the chairman of the Fed, Bernanke, actually rose to the occasion. George Bush didn't want to expand the role of government, but he knew he had to. He was convinced of it, and he provided support for something that he was in some ways instinctively and philosophically against, but he didn't hate government. He just didn't like the idea of this expansion of authority, became convinced it was important. Proposal for a rescue went to the floor of the House, and it was voted down. The market dropped, as I recall, 900 points. And this was the first sign for the world that maybe Americans aren't so steady and certain after all. A couple of days of efforts, and the vote was brought up again. Ironically, a Republican president found his source of support for that vote on the Democratic side of the aisle, although John Boehner was and other leaders in the Republican Party supported the effort. We held together and made a response that, when coupled with the coordinated efforts of the G20 nations, actually prevented the worst from happening. Now, counterfactuals are difficult matters. The public didn't think so well of it. They thought it was a giveaway to the irresponsible bankers, looking out for the big shots but not for ordinary citizens, which then made matters complicated because Barack Obama, a new president, was coming in the midst of this, and even during the campaign, he really felt obliged to join with the outgoing administration and try to forge some cooperation agreement. When Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932, he refused Hoover's invitation to join with him in some coordinated steps. He said, no, that's the Republican recession. We're going to be the Democratic revival. So we blurred the parties this time, and Obama inherited the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. And you know what happened? On day one, previewed before the inauguration, Republicans announced a campaign of absolute opposition to any of his major initiatives. We were in a time of economic crisis. Obama had campaigned on a sort of post-partisan effort to take us beyond these polarized politics. But from day one, he faced that opposition. Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, just very publicly announced it. It's well documented. And there was no real willingness to negotiate on any matters pertaining to stimulus. Obama figured, well, if I make a big part of it tax cuts, then maybe that will entice the Republicans in negotiations. Anybody know what proportion of the stimulus went for tax cuts in 2009? What would you say? 10, 15%, 20? It was 40%. Most members of the public have not a notion that all of their taxes were cut during that time and that taxes was a part of the stimulus. Instead, the line was wasteful government spending. So Obama's strategy of preemptive concessions to try to entice Republicans in negotiations fell flat. What it told us then, something we knew beforehand, this had been developing under different presidents and different Congresses, is that we had set up a permanent campaign, a partisan war that led, sadly, opposition parties into the position of hoping for the worst for the country under the leadership of the opposition. It was a very different take than we had a generation ago in the Congress under similar circumstances. Can you imagine John Rhodes or Jerry Ford or Tip O'Neill taking that position? I think the answer to that is not. He also faced this automatic 60-vote hurdle, and there were only 60 Democrats for about 5 months during that Congress. It took till, May or June for Al Franken's election to be certified and Arlen Specter to switch parties. That created 60, but that included Ben Nelson, and Mary Landrieu and a number of other Democrats who were very uncomfortable ever voting for anything that had no Republican support. So it was a very difficult situation during that time. And I suppose what you'd have to say is it's really amazing that as much got done as did. It was probably one of the more impressive legislative harvests if you count everything that was actually achieved during this period. But the public felt awful about it. Not if you pursued them and asked whether they liked this and this and this, yeah, but once it was associated with a stimulus or with Obama, it was toxic. The Republican strategy was one of absolute opposition. Failing to stop it, it was to delegitimize whatever was achieved and portray it as doing more harm than good. The classic case is the stimulus. Their argument went out with the public. It's just lost out to any fair-minded policy analyst who's looked at the situation. Without the coordinated stimulus efforts across the 20 major economies of the world, we would indeed be in much economic shape. But alas, that was the nature of the beast. So it was opposition, delegitimation. The final one was nullification. I hope you're not offended with me attaching that word to the strategy. It has a meaning in the pre-Civil War period, the John C. Calhoun. It's the right of states to simply not accept laws that were passed by the Congress. This is, and in fact, that is the strategy of choice. It's to repeal or absolutely disarm various pieces of law that were enacted in Barack Obama's first 2 years. But it comes to the point of refusing to even consider confirming appointees to new agencies authorized by law because they don't like the law and therefore they don't want it to operate. Now think about that. I look back for examples in history and I just couldn't find anything quite like that. But that's the intensity of the war. Then the Tea Party movement began up in that spring and proved to be, we were confused about it at first, but it sort of has its roots and its history throughout the years and centuries in America. But it is a very anti-government, socially conservative, nativist, and sort of local and small government movement that was really quite extreme in some of its views, but that was fully embraced by the establishment party. The difference this time is not that there was a populist movement, we've had them on the left and the right, but that it became a critical part of one of our major political parties. Well, then we went to the 2010 election and its aftermath. The election, of course, was a dramatic referendum on the performance of the economy and of the Democratic Party leading that effort. Republicans made huge gains in both houses, especially notable in the House where they took the majority. It's clear the public was scared and angry, and that's what publics do. That's what electorates do across the globe. Times are bad, you throw them out. Try something else to make it work. But at the same time, they said, we want you just to get together and fix it. Well, what have we had in the way of fixing in the first year of the following the 2010 elections? We've had hostage taking, threatening government shutdowns and defaults on our obligations, to honor our debt in order to force immediate spending cuts. Now, were immediate spending cuts a reasonable thing to do at that time? Well, it's not obvious. There are some arguments about that, but it's a little hard to say you're going to help people scared about their jobs and their income by cutting spending, which presumably will lead to layoffs of government contractors as well as federal employees, declines in funds to state and local governments, who will then lay off teachers and policemen. What's it going to do? It's going to give confidence to the markets that we're dealing with our deficit problem? Well, that's reflected in interest rates, and they're at record lows. Haven't moved up, only moved down. Well, what's the point? What are we achieving? Is it actually dealing with the deficit? Well, actually, no. They're patrolling at the margins. They're going after those pieces of the deficit of spending that have not grown in recent years. Let's face it, the reality is that our spending was under control in the 90s. We had slightly higher tax rates, and we turned deficits into surpluses with a really buoyant pattern of growth in the late 1990s. Part of it high-tech bubble-induced, but basically it was good times. Then we had two unfunded wars. We had an expansion of Medicare without, quote, paying for it. We had a huge increase in Homeland Security expenditures after 9/11, and we cut taxes. And all of that turned surpluses into deficits, which then, in conjunction with economic recession, dramatically slowed revenues and forced immediate expenditures for unemployment insurance. They're called automatic stabilizers. We have relatively few compared to most countries, but it was sort of part of what's going on. So the question then becomes, what do we do? We're not clairvoyant on this. It's tough in an economic downturn after a bubble-induced recession, financial crisis. But as best as we can tell, the general sentiment within the community is that we need to do two things at the same time. One, we need in the immediate short term to take whatever steps might produce additional economic growth, because the best way to reduce deficits and debt is to grow the economy. But we know that we have both an intermediate and long-term deficit and debt problem. So we ought to put in place policies that would come into effect after the economy is recovered. That will require substantial increases in revenues, and it will require dramatic reductions in the rate of increase of healthcare expenses. It's just a reality. It's as simple as that. Everything else is rhetoric. Yes, we'll trim back some aspects of defense. We'll trim back some domestic discretionary spending programs. We'll make adjustments in Social Security to make that whole, which we can do pretty easily. But basically, the real story is healthcare costs and revenues. We're now under 16% of GDP in revenues. It's traditionally around 19%. It will probably have to get to 22% or whatever, just because of the aging of the population, the changing composition of the budget. But that's what we need, and yet we can't have that kind of debate in the political arena. We are instead just having babble, banalities, avoidance of what the issues are, and the repetition, endless repetition of talking points prepared by wordmeisters. Each party has them. Frank Luntz is probably the most notorious in this regard, but everyone has their favorite points, and all it does anger and deaden the public response. So, what happened after this episode of the debt ceiling politics and the government shutdown to cut spending? We had an S&P downgrade of U.S. debt. We had a collapse of consumer confidence that independently slowed the rate of economic growth. We saw incredible decline in the reputation of the U.S. around the world and near zero trust in government. As I left town, we're having yet another episode. You'd think the signals would have been sent clearly. Another episode. This supposedly was resolved as part of the final agreement on the raising the debt ceiling. Both parties agreed to a set of caps on appropriations for the operation of government, and everyone agreed what the exact number was for the next fiscal year, 2012. But now a decision was made to put supplementary funding for FEMA to deal with this extraordinary run of disasters that we've had with money running out, attach it to that, and then have some offsetting cuts in part of Obama's stimulus program that goes for creating green energy jobs, because Republicans kind of wanted to stick it to him, and it gave Boehner an opportunity to sort of keep under some measure of control his most enthusiastic Tea Party members. The Senate voted with 10 Republicans aligning themselves with Democrats to do as they always do for emergency spending, not make it hold to the budget caps. That's the whole nature of it. And actually, given the state of the economy, that kind of spending immediately is good. It will have a multiplier effect beyond its actual spending. But they dug in their heels and went home. And so the government shuts down on Friday if they don't resolve it. We presume they will. They're coming back tonight. The Senate will vote again. It easily defeated the proposition passed in the House. By the way, the House vote went down first because conservatives said there's not enough spending cuts, even though this was the agreement that was sort of in ink. And Boehner had a choice. He could sort of try to tilt it right or work out a deal with Pelosi to get 50, 60, 80, 100 Democrats. And he chose for the former just because of the dynamics within the Republican Party. It's not a pretty picture. So what I would suggest to you is that public unhappiness at the time of the 2010 election has produced the opposite of what they want. More infighting and partisan bitterness and hostage-taking and economic uncertainty. So the question is, and I will conclude on this topic, does the 2012 election offer more promise? What do you think? I've been looking, and I'm not real encouraged. I'm looking at the Republican presidential nomination contest, and I am struck. I mean, set aside some of the marginal candidates who aren't going anywhere. Remind you of the bar scene in the Star Wars movie at times. But just take this, sort of take the serious candidates. We're not talking about just repealing Obamacare and dramatic cuts in spending and more cuts in taxes. We're really talking about fundamentally restructuring or repealing aspects of the Great Society and the New Deal. It is more radical than the Goldwater activist of 1964. That dynamic is powerful because the Tea Party is very active in the Republican primaries, but also because that's what has happened. The voices of moderation within the Republican Party that were once the centerpiece of wisdom and good sense and policy making has given way to a situation where those who remain feel exceedingly uncomfortable. You will get almost every former elected Republican official who was operational, who was sort of pragmatic, to bemoan that development within their party, and it should be a prime focus when we say, what can the election do to fix this? Then we have President Obama, who spent most of 3 years, contrary to some of the critics on the right, but overemphasized by his critics on the left, that he was so accommodative, making preemptive concessions. Well, he was facing reality and looking to see what he could get done. In the first 2 years, he got quite a bit done. In the third year, he thought that a government shutdown or a default on our debt would, in and of itself, precipitate an economic crisis, bad for the country and bad for his reelection. He feels out from under those threats now, and what you're beginning to see is a strategy that comes out of game theory, which is how to deal with a prisoner's dilemma when the other side is constantly defecting. The normal thing is a strategy of cooperation. It doesn't work. Experiments prove what works is tit for tat. So you respond with clarity and force, and that sometimes creates conditions under which negotiations will take place. I'm not real encouraged that any such success will be realized in the next months before the election. I have no hopes for the super committee, and we may get a little tax relief from the extension and expansion of the payroll tax and some incentives for small business, which would be good, but getting some real bucks to put people to work on our disgraceful physical infrastructure seems rather unlikely. So what do we have going on leading up to the election? We have a fight to set the terms of the election. The Republicans want it to be, are you better off or worse off? Are you satisfied with how this president has led the country during these times? He wanted it as a referendum on the performance of the president. That's how it usually works. Strong partisans stick with their party. The smaller group in the middle, pure independents, without leaning one way or the other, are the classic referendum voters. Things are good, stick with them. Things are bad, throw them out. Don't bother me with any more information. I got more important things on my mind. This is not the source of great information gathering, ideological perspectives, and problem solving. So what is Obama trying to do? He's trying to make it a choice election. He's trying to say, listen, I inherited this mess. The predicate for the mess was 8 years of a Republican administration that embraced policies that contributed to it. Others did as well, going back further, but hey, look at what they want to do. This is extreme. This is radical. It's outside the mainstream of the country, and there's no compelling substantive case for cutting spending, right? Further reductions in taxes, as Paul Ryan's budget plan calls for, a withdrawal from the sort of guaranteed benefits of Social Security and Medicare, and sort of moving those programs into a very different individual-focused basis. It may be a good way to pursue a particular ideological view and set of values, but it doesn't seem to have much promise of getting anywhere. Anyways, those are the choices. Both are going to be at play, and what in the world is produced by way of signals or messages? What we see now is an anti-incumbent reaction by the public that's likely to be harmful to office holders of both parties. Now, what's that going to produce? It'd probably give us a Republican president and diminished Republican majority in the House, and probably because Democrats have 20 seats up and Republicans 23 seats up and Republicans only 10, a Republican majority in the Senate, but well short of a majority. It seems to me there isn't much reason to be happy. A visceral anti-Congress, anti-Washington, anti-government sentiment will be, in my view, no more productive than the 2010 election. Well, then there's another alternative, and that's the one you're going to be hearing more about this afternoon. The idea for a third party or independent presidential candidates. Americans elect is a sort of digital-based nominating system to identify a candidate who will speak truth to the American people and lead us out of the desert. Well, I say Godspeed to their efforts, but I'm a skeptic. I think the whole effort is based on an incorrect premise, that we have two polarized parties leaving a radical center in the American public unrepresented. And if someone would move to fill in that space, they would find lots of room to operate. How they govern without having facing two polarized parties in Congress is another question. But again, that's a faith. What are the problems? A false equivalence between the parties, as I've suggested to you. They aren't equally polarized right now. The Democrats were further to the left in the 60s and 70s, and Republicans are way to the right on the present day. It's not that problem. Obama is the centrist candidate, and therefore what it means is a third-party candidate preaching moderation and reasonableness and compromise would almost certainly come from the center-left of the party, ensuring a conservative Republican victory. Third, the public is polarized too. There aren't all that many folks in the, quote, center. There is no golden mean in American politics. Most Americans see the world through their partisan lenses, and even those who say they're independents, when you ask them, but do you lean to the Democratic or Republican Party, most do, and they act like partisans. There's only 10% of the electorate as opposed to the public. That's this pure independence, and they are the ones that have the least information, the least sense of what to do and how to do it, and I just... I think it's a distraction. You've got to go with the party system you have and figure out how to make change. If you believe that the agenda of the new Republican Party offers us a future that you wish for, you desire, and think will be constructive, then you've got to think of supporting Republicans at every level and giving them as much power to do that. If on the other hand, you're fearful, just voting anti-incumbent does nothing. So I end with this. To me, the challenge is not right now to change our electoral system or change our political institutions, both of which I'd love to do, but I know how difficult it is, but at least in the short term to get the public to think more strategically about its power. In the end, the health of a democracy rests with the electorate. That requires some effort, some attention, and some clear thinking, and it's up to all of us to try to make those stakes, those choices, the alternative schemes for governing, rather than, let's just all get together and be civil and bipartisan. Make that as clear as possible. Fight the blabberings of talk radio and cable TV and the faux balance of the establishment media and the sort of nonpartisan goo-goos. Get in. Politics ain't beanball. It's rough and tough. Figure out what you're for, what you believe in, and what it takes to actually produce a government that has some chance of delivering what you think is needed to provide a bright future for all of us. Thank you very much.
I have a question for you, Tom. What would Conable or Frenzel and where would they be in this whole thing? And what's the difference between what we had when I was in the Republican leadership and we walked across the aisle? I'm having trouble trying to get my arms around how we got in this bloody mess.
Democrats abused their long-term control of the House, and Republicans, after a while, began electing members who weren't content to stick with this. Newt Gingrich, who I met after his election to the House and initiated a group of discussions with members of that class, was the one who envisioned the guerrilla war, the effort to depose the permanent Democratic majority by leading a guerrilla war to discredit the institution as a whole. It was bare knuckles. It was aggressive. Some of the most outstanding Republican members at the time lost out to Newt, but he kept working at it, and that led to charges of ethics, impropriety, flowing both ways. It got to much stronger feelings. Republicans wanting to be in the majority. Why should they be the permanent minority in the House? And it set up a kind of arms race that was reinforced by the changing attachment of various interest groups to one party or the other. That really did it. You used to have groups that, like environmentalists, work with Democrats and Republicans. Strong environmental tradition, the old Republican Party, but that's virtually gone now. And different kind of tactics, encouraged again by the rhetoric of the partisan news outlets, of the right primarily, but of the left in response. All of that contributed, Lou, to this problem. I'll tell you where Bill Frenzel is, since I talk to him all the time. He still holds out the hope of a sort of grand compromise. Of course Republicans should agree to tax increases. It's inevitable. The Grover Norquist's pledge is ridiculous, and any member of Congress who would sign it is abdicating his or her responsibility under the Constitution, and thinks that actually Obama's someone they could do business with, and also believe he can bring along most of the Democratic Party. You see, the difference now is Republicans have become the insurgent party, and Democrats are the party of conservation, of protection, of what evolved in terms of government responsibility, starting with Teddy Roosevelt and moving through to the present. There's no chance of expanding. There are enormous fiscal problems as well. There are enormous challenges arising because of the global economy and the competitiveness challenges. So Clinton initiated it. You got to be smart. Individual responsibility is important, along with sort of community and opportunity, and you've got to blend those two traditions in America together. And that's where the sort of leadership of the Democratic Party is, but they're in a protective mode, and that's not very exciting, and it doesn't mobilize the electorate. But it's the Republicans now who really want to, we used to say 2, 4, 6, 8, let's go out and crush the state, right? I mean, it's just, I knew I had some libertarians here. and so that sort of generates the really strong feeling. That's where the mobilization and interest is is now, but if Americans started thinking, okay, Medicare isn't going to be there, we'll have a voucher, we'll put a cap on it, and then you got to come up with a resource on top of that to buy insurance. It's that way, or trying to slow the cost increases by changing the whole structure of medical care. Virtually every other major country does it much better than us for a whole lot less money, so it's worth thinking about. Anyways, that pattern has existed, and some of our favorite members on the Republican side of the aisle have just left. The pressure now within the party conference is enormous to stick together because it's all about branding yourself for the next election. It's a permanent war that's underway, and legislating is the last thing. Are there people on the left in the Democratic Party you could say some of these things about? Sure, they're individuals, but the center of gravity and the leadership, led by Presidents first Clinton and now Obama, are sort of very much in the let's adapt, protect, modernize, make it work, rather than let's bring it all down. Ayn Rand is the hero of today's Republican Party. I've read those books, but doesn't get a lot of faithful reading on the Democratic side of the aisle.
Has trickle-down economics ever been shown to actually work? If so, when? And if not, why do people keep advocating for it?
Yeah, the question is a term Bill Clinton used to use a lot, trickle-down economics. The argument is that cutting sort of marginal tax rates, particularly at the upper end of the scale, will eventually lead to more investment, more economic activity, more jobs, and eventually higher standards of living for the rest of the citizens. That's an argument. In fact, the desire to cut marginal rates has been with us for decades now. We used to have, by the way, in times of our greatest growth, highest growth rates with the most equitable division of the fruits of that growth were in the 60s and the just first years of the 70s when the marginal rates were catastrophic. They were really high. I mean, they were 70% or so, but there were obviously tax avoidance, ways of making them effectively lower. But we haven't seen any real evidence that cutting rates in this fashion dramatically increases desirable economic activity. What we have seen is that Bush 41, George Herbert Walker Bush, first in response to deficits and pressure on the budget, agreed to a modest increase in the marginal tax rate on the upper income. Bill Clinton did the same thing, and following that, after forecast of economic recession and disaster, we had buoyant economic growth. So that suggests sort of raising taxes modestly on upper income did not, in fact, lead to less economic activity. Similarly, in the Tax Reform Act of 1978, Ronald Reagan, rates were lowered, the base was broadened. That's always a good thing to do. Tax reform should try to broaden the base by getting rid of all the deductions and credits and so on. Let it be clean and lower the rates. But he raised capital gains taxes so that it was equal to income taxes. The argument being you don't want to set up all these efforts to try to reclassify earnings as capital gains. It leads to all kinds of distortions and the rest. And again, economic activity did fine. Then in 2001, we had the first of several tax cuts. Okay, what happened? Economic growth was lower. There was less investment. So on its face, the argument that cutting taxes always increases economic activity is just simply wrong. But there are ranges. In general, you ought to tax things you don't want more of, you want less of. For example, we ought to have a carbon tax in this country. We use too much carbon. It would be wonderful for the economy, for the environment. It's a very sensible thing to do, but it's politically explosive, and we've had a hard time facing the inevitable. We could have a progressive consumption tax that would, again, sort of encourage people to spend in ways that produce real value to them and to save, and it would make a difference as well. There are various kinds of tax changes that would be very healthy for this country, but I think one of the things we shouldn't worry too much about is whether the earnings of hedge fund owners, which are measured these days in billions of dollars, would, if they were treated as regular earnings and not as capital gains or carried interest, I would not fear for the future of our country. That is, there are ways of recovering, of collecting taxes that by and large net out to a plus.
How do you feel about Herman Cain's 999 plan and its ability to revitalize our economy?
I have. It's the idea of a sort of flat tax has been discussed in the Congress for decades and decades. It's when a candidate like this uses it as the platform that's going to transform the American economy, gee, it sounds so good. That's the way we talk about it. What will it do for the job creators and the like? But then you start parsing it, and I recommend, if you've found it attractive, of doing some research. The Tax Policy Center .org, a joint operation of my Brookings Institution and the Urban Institute, has done a good deal of work on this, looking both at sort of its impact on economic activity, on the distribution of wealth. It turns out it would do very little to compensate for the dramatic increase in economic and wealth inequality that we've had over times. And there are just massive obstacles to any kind of sort of start from scratch tax system. But it's a catchy phrase. It's an interesting set of ideas. My recommendation is don't just go to Herman Cain's website for it. Go to the Tax Policy Center. Go to the CBO. Begin to investigate just what is it? What is it predicated on? Who would win? Who would lose? Would it be economically productive or not?